Stanford University.
Robinson, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this joint production of the Stanford Historical Society and Hillel at Stanford. And before I say anything further, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Michael Copeland, who is the Hillel rabbi, who would also like to greet everybody.
Hello. Welcome. I am thrilled that this event is happening tonight and here at Hillel. Even in the 8.5 or so years that I've been here, there has been a massive amount of change in the Jewish community. And to be able to be here tonight and hear the entire history is a gift. So thank you all. Thank you to the Historical Society for making this happen. Since we're not going to focus so much tonight on the buildings and the changes in the last several years, if you have any questions, I'll be here afterwards. I'd love to give you an impromptu tour, tell you anything about the windows, the art, the exhibits, the buildings, the history, anything else that you might want to fill in. It's just a pleasure to have you. Thanks so much.
And the reason that I am up here is because I am the co-chair, along with Peter Stansky, of the program committee of the Stanford Historical Society. But that aside, it's other more compelling reasons why I'm actually here tonight. My affiliation and interest in Jewish life at Stanford began when I came here to the Graduate School of Education to get my degree, and after that I was a dean in the Office of Student Affairs for many years, and I also served on the board of Hillel. So this topic is one that is near and dear to my heart. Just a couple of words about tonight's program and the building in which we are meeting. For those of you who are longtime Stanford buffs, you will know that the house in front of the building that we are in now was once the home of Roz and Harold Bacon. And it is now the Taube Hillel House, which is part of the Center for Jewish Life at Stanford. So if you knew the Bacons, even if you didn't, and you're interested in seeing how beautifully restored the house was, I hope you had a chance to wander through on your way over to this building, which is the newest part of the Center for Jewish Life at Stanford. And as Rabbi Copeland said, I hope you get a chance to look around at the stained glass windows and the rest of the building. It's really beautiful. As far as tonight's program, I know a lot of people are thinking, well, this is going to be a history of Jewish life at Stanford. And while there will be some history that is covered, the purpose of tonight's program is not so much to retell the history from day one of Jewish life at Stanford, but more to convey to all of us who are here a sense of the vibrancy and complexity of Jewish life at Stanford University today. I mean, it's a remarkably different place for Jewish students, faculty, and staff than it was even 30 years ago or more when I got here as a graduate student. So there will be some of that, but it's really to let you have a look at what Jewish life is like today at Stanford. So to get on to the more interesting part of the program and get me off the stage, I would like to introduce the moderator for tonight's program, my dear friend Robin Kennedy. And I asked her to be the narrator tonight for many reasons, one of which is she is a dear friend, and so she couldn't say no, and therefore I would not have to be the moderator for tonight's program. More important than that, Robin's connections with the Jewish community at Stanford are so varied and so numerous that it's difficult to capture all of them, but I'm going to try in briefly. She is a two-time Stanford alumna, an undergraduate and law degree. The same can be said for her daughter, so she's a two-time Stanford parent. She was a campus homeowner. She was on the Hillel board, I think perhaps the longest-serving member of the Hillel board and its longest-serving president. She was an employee at the university in the initially director of the real estate programs and lands management, and later she was one of 5 real estate attorneys in the Office of General Counsel. She was the First Lady of Stanford as the wife of our wonderful President Don Kennedy. She is the Robin part of the Don and Robin Kennedy Kosher Co-op. She's currently serving in the Jewish chaplaincy at Stanford Hospital. And with Dawn, she serves as a named honoree of an undergraduate writing prize in Jewish studies, which is given annually in their honor. So there are probably more things, Robin's role in how this building came to be, but that's enough. I don't want Robin to get too much of a swelled head over all of this. And so I am going to turn the program over to Robin.
Thank you. Thank you, Norm. I want to begin this evening's program with some historic context through a few anecdotes, followed by the presentation from our wonderful panelists. We hope you will get a sense of just how far Jewish life at Stanford has come. Although there has been a Jewish presence at Stanford since its inception, it took nearly a century for Jews and Judaism to become fully integrated into our university, thus erasing decades of what my friend Bob Rosenzweig once called Stanford's innocent indifference to Jews. A few entries from the early years. In November of 1891, Leland Stanford invited a member of a prominent San Francisco Jewish family, Leon Sloss Sr., to fill an early vacancy on the Board of Trustees. In his letter, he tells Leland, "Your worthy parents I have known long and favorably. The character of your parents is the best guarantee of your future." In Stanford's first conference game against USC in 1927, football hero Herbert Fleischecker Jr. battered his way as a fullback 20 yards to the 3-yard line, then threw a pass to tie the score 13-13. The father of a Jewish student bringing his son, class of 1954, to freshman orientation, asked the dean of students about Jewish activities for students on campus. The dean responded that there were no activities for Jewish students. The student and some friends formed the Brandeis Club, the first record of any association of Jewish students. In the late 50s, my husband, then at Syracuse, declined an offer from the Stanford Biology Department, one that he would accept a year later. In the meantime, however, the then executive head of the department asked Don if he could recommend someone else. Upon Don's strong recommendation of his close friend, Tim Goldsmith, the chairman asked Don if Tim were Jewish. It was difficult to avoid the conclusion that, at least at that time, the biology department felt that one additional Jewish faculty member might be one too many. In 1965, Rabbi Charles Familant became Stanford's first Hillel director. His tiny office was located over a tire shop in downtown Palo Alto on Emerson Street. Services were held in that small space, attended only by graduate students since few undergraduates had cars. When a medical student asked Rabbi Familant to gather a minyan on campus to say Kaddish for the student's recently deceased father, Rabbi Familant made a private arrangement with the coordinator of the women's clubhouse, which we now know as the Old Union, for the temporary use of a lounge. Within 3 days, the dean of students called Rabbi Familant, reminding him of the university policy that a service conducted by any member of the clergy must happen only in Memorial Church. A Stanford Daily article appeared the following day sporting the headline, quote, "Rabbi barred from religious services on campus," unquote. The size of the minyan rose to nearly 50 students, many of them perhaps not Jewish, following which Rabbi Familant received a letter from then-President Wallace Stirling, informing him that continuation of this activity was unacceptable. In 1968, I served as a student member of a committee on undergraduate admissions and financial aid for a broad study of education at Stanford undertaking. A presentation to that committee from the Dean of Admissions confirmed a widely held rumor that Stanford then had a 3% Jewish quota for undergraduate students. The information was conveyed to the committee without apology or embarrassment. The fact that until 2004, Hillel was housed in about 700 square feet in the basement of the Old Union is emblematic of a university in which the president's house, host to multiple official events over the holidays, was decorated annually with Christmas lights, a Christmas tree, and a creche, in which neither the academic calendar nor the schedule for reunion events was changed to adjust to the high holy days, so that for decades Jewish students had to choose between participation in freshman orientation and or the first day of classes and attendance at services, in which kosher food was unavailable, in which Hillel's development director was not provided access to the Office of Development database, in which alumni donations to Hillel do not count in the total of reunion class giving, in which a Jewish trustee coming to campus during Passover, and I was there, and I can swear to this, was served a cold, quartered matzo ball on his bread plate at the major dinner event, and in which the institution, unlike its peers around the country, made no financial contribution to the acquisition of the land or the cost of building a home for this Hillel. It is now my pleasure to introduce the members of our panel. To save time, these introductions are necessarily brief, so my focus will be on the aspect of their biographies that presage their presentations today. Professor Steven Zipperstein is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish History and Culture. In 1991, he was appointed the first director of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies, a post he held for 15 years. Steve has taught at Oxford, Harvard, and at universities in France, Russia, and Poland. He is the recipient of the Judah L. Magnus Gold Medal from the American Friends of the Hebrew University and of the Koret Prize for outstanding contributions to Jewish life. A renowned scholar, writer, and teacher, Steve is currently at work on a cultural history of the Jews in Russia from 19th century to the present. Rabbi Patricia Carla Newman has a BA in Liberal Arts from Johnson College, an MA in Hebrew Letters, and an honorary degree, Doctor of Divinity from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. Ordained in 1982, Rabbi Patty served as Hillel co-director at UCLA, as chaplain and Hillel director of the Claremont Colleges, and as a congregational rabbi at Temple Israel in Alameda before coming to Stanford as Associate Dean for Religious Life at Stanford in 1996. Her appointment to that position in an office that had theretofore been called the Office of the Dean of Memorial Church was a cataclysmic event in Stanford's efforts to achieve diversity, as she was the first non-Christian member of the clergy to be employed as such by the university. Patty is now Stanford's Senior Associate Dean for Religious Life. Joe Gettner, a senior in mechanical engineering, hails from Madisonville, a small town of 4,000 people in the southeastern corner of Tennessee. As a freshman, he was on the Hillel Frosh Council. Since then, he has remained very involved with the Jewish Student Association, serving as Shabbat chair, and last year as its president. Joe cannot remember the name of the award he just won, but it's something like Mensch of the Year for all of all universities in the country. I now would like to introduce Professor Zipperstein. Steve?
Thank you. Robin, thank you very much. I was asked to speak about the past, and I would imagine the Stanford Historical Society wouldn't mind hearing a bit about the past. This is not an attempt to provide a comprehensive history of all that's happened with regard to Jewish life, and not with regard to Stanford Jewish scholarship. I've been receiving emails from various people over the course of the last couple of days saying, well, don't forget me, don't forget this. And I won't mention all names, and please forgive me. It's not simply for want of time, and each of us was asked to speak for no more than about 12 minutes so that we could have a full discussion, but also because, as I see it, these are really musings, the sort of bits and pieces that might later be used as a kind of mosaic and be used towards some kind of oral history, but hopefully not much less, but not more. And I'll structure these remarks along the following lines. At first, I'll offer some preliminary musings about the singular, the joys, pressures, features of building Jewish life in this region. I'll then try to apply some of them to Stanford specifically, and then talk about a bit about the building of Jewish studies at Stanford. Stanford is now generally seen as one of the great centers of Jewish studies, and I say that not only because I was director for a long time, but there's ample proof of that standing. And I want to speak about how, to a large extent, we built this out of the sheer irony of Jewish studies at Stanford, and we're able to utilize that irony toward what we did. We were also building an incredibly congenial atmosphere, and we were building very much on the shoulders of the great Donald Kennedy. But let me offer the following few general observations. A session like this, I think, is all the more important because history tends to slip away here. It's quite why we haven't the time to speak about. Like so much in life, it's a two-edged sword, because it means that people forget so easily. Apropos of this, very soon after Don stepped down as president, and only a year or two after I came to Stanford, ostensibly to build a program in Jewish studies, Mike Keller, then still the head of the library, and I decided that we were going to announce a major campaign for the building of a Jewish studies library. We already had the Talbot Bar collection, but needed an immense amount more in order to create a real research library. I made a tabulation of all the books I used that year for the book that I was writing, and 90% of everything I needed, I had to order an interlibrary loan. That was the state of our library then. It's now one of the finest Jewish research libraries in the world. In any event, Mike Keller and I designed a program. We brought in basically every Jewish donor in the area, because we brought in Milton Friedman, who we had older people who were looking at this man as if he was Michael Jackson, or one of the Beatles. I'd never seen such adoration on the faces of people. We paired him with Leonard Fine. We were about to announce this campaign, and I was told by my dean an hour before the program, we are not to have a campaign. We can't. This is not necessarily a university priority. And Mike and I looked at one another a few minutes before the program, and we said, but they won't stop us from buying books. And so we didn't announce a campaign, but we bought 15 major collections. And just an addendum to that story, when I stepped down as director of Jewish studies before leave to Harvard a couple of years ago, I was at some small meal with various deans, and that dean who had stopped us from actually waging the campaign was there celebrating the great success of Jewish studies. Of course, she had forgotten, everyone had forgotten, forgetfulness is sometimes good. And rigid boundaries are sometimes bad. And the fluidity, the porousness, I had never encountered the term fudgeability before coming to Stanford, have encountered it countless times since. That's not a terrible feature of life here. And I could say as an historian, sometimes it's actually better to live without thick history. But history is important too. And so the first feature I would mention that's distinctive about this place is that kind of historical sparsity, which can cut both ways. The next general aspect that I'd like to mention has to do with the way in which a session like this ought not to deal only with Judaism as a practice faith, but just about what it feels like to be Jewish, which is made of so many components beyond faith, as all of us know. By sheer coincidence, I was at a lunch very soon after I received the invitation to come to Stanford. I was then at UCLA. And every single person at the lunch, and I don't exaggerate, it wasn't a huge number, 5 or 6 couples had their own Stanford story. I remember one woman talking about how it was the only college, she still wore these bruises, the only college that she had been rejected from because she felt the reason was because Stanford was the only place she applied to. This would have been sometime in the late-ish 60s, where they asked also for her mother's maiden name. And I was told, and again, these stories are like urban legends, and one has no idea whether these are true or not, that in order to get into Stanford in the 50s and a bit later, one needed to demonstrate one was good at two sports. So, some of us learned how to play basketball when we were young, but two sports maybe and somewhat beyond that. So, so this kind of frostiness. It's hard to quite characterize it, but what I did encounter in coming here in the early 90s was a place that, while in contrast to Berkeley that still lived somewhere deep in the 60s, Stanford seemed to inhabit the Adlai Stevenson 50s. And with many of its components, a kind of commitment to integrationism, which can't be bad, certainly in contrast to many of its alternatives, but which meant that any kind of egregious separatism, and in the kind of egregious separatism that Jews exhibit, I mean, why is it if you live socioeconomically like Episcopalians that you somehow feel yourself like African Americans? And I mean, just look at the mirror. And the kind of peculiar sociocultural features of Jewish life didn't altogether make sense here. I think the most vivid example, and I can't go into the detail into this in any detail, was that ferocious debate in Palo Alto over the Eruv. 5 or 6 years ago. Fortunately, it was all resolved quietly behind the scenes. No one's life has been ruined. There is an Eruv. I don't know that any of you breathe any more heavily. But there was enormous debate, and it was debate all about separatism and all kinds of tropes that would never have arisen in Berkeley, which has its own form of intolerance, and I recognize that, but not this particular form. And I did feel when I came here in the 90s that for the very first time I experienced a kind of the vague residue of what older colleagues of mine would have experienced before, which I've come to understand almost as a kind of Adlai Stevenson liberalism, and one remembers very good things about him, and since his death, one has encountered other aspects of Adlai Stevenson as well. And finally, one other curious feature, and again, I'm not going to go into any detail about this, and this was an exceptionally contentious period, is that this is a region with both the most liberal politics, Jewish and otherwise, probably in the United States, and yet this is the only Jewish community that actually has imposed an oath onto the community with regard to attitudes toward Israel. Last year, in the wake of an enormous debate over the Jewish Film Festival, a debate now completely forgotten because it was essentially absurd, but the enormous contrast here in this Jewish community, not expressed quite as vividly in the South Bay, much more so in the East Bay, between a hard left that sees itself very much as part of Jewish life and a hard right, and those who've moved in various directions in the last few years in the wake of the tragic Gaza war, in the wake of other things happening in Israel, is a feature of life here, and a feature worth taking in. To apply some of those general stories to the growing of Jewish studies at Stanford. It's a program that starts in the 80s and which could not have taken off without Don Kennedy's leadership. These kind of initiatives are most successful if they come from the top and also from some of the more distinguished faculty in the humanities and elsewhere at Stanford. Some of those people are in the room and who did these sort of heavy lifting of trying to explain that this wasn't an intrinsically parochial things. That they weren't trying to bring to Stanford a kind of theological school. That Jewishness is something enormously expansive. I think the person in this respect who was most important was Peter Stansky. But what helped us a great deal in raising funds, and we raised funds vigorously, and I think have used them sensibly and happily raised almost entirely endowed money, was if you will, there's that marvelous joke in Freud's book of jokes where he speaks about a Jew on a train, and he's untied his tie, and he's taken off his coat, and he's put his feet on the other chair, and then this bourgeois man comes into the same compartment, and so he puts back on his coat, and he ties back on his tie. Of course, he takes his foot off the chair, and then the other man's reading a newspaper. They're traveling for about an hour, and after an hour, the second man turns to the first man and says, "Do you know what time the Sabbath begins tonight?" And so the first man, and this is where Freud is marvelous. The crucial word in the joke is "ah." And so he unties his tie, he takes off his coat, and he puts his feet on. We were shielded by Episcopalians, so I know that our fundraising was all the more successful because I'm not going to use the word prophylactic, our donors behaved differently at Stanford than they would have at Yeshiva University. I could have had all of my skills, rhetorical and otherwise, and tried to raise money at a different sort of place, less shielded, and I'm not sure that it would have been quite as successful. And I say that I'm perhaps being terribly candid. I've stepped down as director, but in as much as we're recording history, I think it's a bit of history that's worthwhile recording. I think among the aspects of Jewish studies, among the aspects of Stanford that we were enormously attentive to in building Jewish studies is that nothing could stand separately in a place like this. You have to integrate. Stanford is deeply committed to integrated knowledge. And we knew that if we were going to build Jewish studies, and we knew enough about the presumption that Jewish studies was seen as something small and tribal, that everyone involved in it had to be able to intersect with many different sectors. And I think that's one of the keys to our success. Building, and there are many of you in this room who've built academic units of various sorts, much of it is a product of good fortune and luck. You could hire a person during these courtship processes that are searches. They come in, they behave well, and then you could end up with a lunatic for the next 35 years of your life. We were fortunate in that we actually ended up with a group of people, of wonderful scholars, who actually like being in the same room together. And I can't tell you how rare that is in academia, and it's certainly rare in Jewish studies. And one other comment, and then I'll finish. I just thought I would share a story because, as a historian, I know how crucial stories are in what it is and how it is we stitch together the past. So, as I mentioned, first under the leadership of Roger Kahn, the first Reinhardt curator in Jewish studies at Green Library, later under the leadership of Zachary Baker, the current curator of Jewish studies, a marvelous man who's also now the assistant head of all collections for the library under Mike Keller. We bought no fewer than 15 collections. We moved across the full expanse of Jewish studies. We have the entire rabbinic collection of the rabbis of Northern Europe that we acquired. We also acquired the entire collection of Yisrael Cohen, who was the general secretary of the Federation of Hebrew Writers in Palestine and then in Israel, and consequently had every single book that was published in Jewish Palestine, beginning in the early 30s and into the 60s. And let me just tell you a story, now that I'm allowed to not be candid, now that I've stepped down as director, about the acquisition of this library. Is one of my favorite stories about negotiation and about how in negotiation sometimes you break rules. So the acquisition of this library was completely public. There was a debate in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, as to whether it should leave the state of Israel. There was no other no library in Israel that had the capacity to acquire it, because acquiring acquiring books, more money is spent on preservation than actually acquisition. You have to raise a huge amount of money for preservation. In any event, the agreement was made, or so I thought. So I happened to be in Israel at the Institute for Advanced Study and at the Hebrew University the year that we were cutting the deal, and so I was involved in some of the actual negotiation. Now, for reasons that I can't remember, the check was to be cut some 24 hours after the books had to be removed because it had to do with shipping stuff. And so I'm sitting there negotiating with the heirs to the library, the children of Israel Cohen. I've just now, it's a terrible indiscretion. And they say to me, how are we to give you a check if you were to remove the books and the check doesn't clear until after the books are removed? I ended up meeting with people from Bank Leumi. Actually, one person in Bank Leumi told me that these people were so difficult that she actually cried. I mean, could you imagine what a manager in Bank Leumi has seen? And these people actually made her cry. In any event, I mean, it's at some point that they turned to me and they said, how can we give you the money and have the books taken out 24 hours before? And I said, do you think I'm representing a makolet, which means a corner store, in Afula? Afula is like the Fresno of Israel. It turns out the guy I'm negotiating with is from Afula. He begins to yell at me about Afula, about how Afula is denigrated. And I simply started to yell. I threw away every lesson I had ever learned of civility. And believe me, when you move from rabbinical school, as I did, to a place like Stanford, you take civility very seriously. And as soon as I started yelling, the conversation became sweet. And he started telling me about his grandfather who had known Isaac Babel. He knew that I was interested in Odessa. He took out some Russian books from the shelf. He gave me these books. The negotiation was finished. We have the books in our library. And I've never said anything bad about Afula since. Thank you.
It's a delight to see so many friends here. And I'm mindful that while there are a couple of us who are up here, there are many of you who are sitting in the chairs there that could probably say a lot more about Jewish life at Stanford than we could. I'm a newcomer, after all, having come in 96. Steve talked about irony. I want to discuss paradox. Like many of us, my attention is still turned to Tucson and President Obama's appeal that we honor the victims of this weekend's tragedy, and particularly Christina Green, the child born on 9/11, by becoming a nation worthy of her imagination and dreams. The heartbroken Jane and Leland Stanford, too, acted out of a similar internal appeal when they lost their son and created Stanford to memorialize and embody their hopes for him. So it's paradoxical that the campaign for Jewish worship at Stanford was initiated by a young medical student who wanted to honor his beloved father by saying Kaddish, the traditional Jewish prayer in memory of one who has died. The outlines of a paradox exist at the heart of Stanford. As many of you know, on the advice of Andrew White, the founding president of Cornell, Stanford was avowedly and militantly free of denominational and sectarian roots. Yet Jane Stanford professed she would be better satisfied to see every department of the university secondary to the church work and the church influence stand out supreme in the whole future of every student. Take away the moral and spiritual from higher education, and I want nothing to do with this or any other university. So, when the founding faculty advocated that Palm Drive lead to that library, Jane Stanford insisted instead that it lead to Memorial Church. And since we know the architecture of the campus, we know who won. The founding grant stipulated that all religious worship was to take place in Memorial Church. And that stipulation went unchallenged until the mid-60s, as Robin mentioned, when Rabbi Famelin, together with the campus ministers, argued that the founding grant itself created the opposite of what the Stanfords had hoped. In fact, high church Episcopalian worship held a monopoly at Stanford and in Memorial Church. Richard Lyman, at the time, was chairing a committee on religious activities, and he appreciated this paradox. And he advocated what he called opening up Memorial Church, that is, allowing religious services to be offered by denominations. This was wonderfully helpful for the Methodists and the Baptists and even the Unitarians, but it didn't do very much for the Jews. Charles Famelin told me that in this conversation back and forth, the discussion ran something like this. Well, we recognize it's problematic for Jews to worship in the sanctuary of Memorial Church. What do you think about the choir room? So, this brings us back to the bereaved medical student seeking to say Kaddish. In 1966, he contacted Rabbi Famelin, who checked with the appropriate administrators and received permission and proceeded to hold worship at 5 p.m. daily, including on Friday nights. But 3 weeks after this took place, he received a letter that public worship was prohibited. And that enterprising daily reporter, who was himself a Catholic considering going to become a clergy person himself, considering the priesthood, followed the religion beat. And when he wrote that front page article with the headlines, "Rabbi Barred from Services," it ignited a moment of civil disobedience where religion and the 60s became linked. Rabbi Famelin cannot participate in worship services in any other worship facility but Memorial Church, said the letter, because of the explicit limitation in the February trustees' resolution, which specifies denominational worship at Stanford may be conducted only within the church. While the university was prepared to authorize informal assembly of Jewish students for the purpose of private prayer, we simply cannot authorize Rabbi Famelin to conduct Sabbath services outside Memorial Church. So Charles tried valiantly to explain that you either have private worship or a minyan, but there isn't a minyan that isn't public worship. So we were operating with different categories, and of course appropriated categories from Christianity. Game on. Civil disobedience meets the 60s. As Robin said, students flocked to services, many of them flummoxed by the Hebrew in their prayer books and were holding their prayer books upside down. The faculty joined the leadership of Robert McAfee Brown, and the ministers in the Stanford Associated Ministers refused to lead worship for their own denominations until the Jews were allowed to have worship services. Now, the trustees, to be fair, were in a place they didn't choose to be in. They were simply trying to enforce the stipulations of the founding grant. They recognized that they were trying to defend something that perhaps they personally found indefensible, but were nonetheless in the position of having to justify. So fortunately, this was a moment of transition in Memorial Church, and the search committee had just hired, but not yet had come to campus, B. Davy Napier, who was coming from Yale. And they called him, and he said, well, perhaps we should interpret Memorial Church as all worship taking place under the auspices of the person responsible for Memorial Church, not simply the geographic location. So being downright Talmudic in the way in which he parsed this, he created a rubric which enabled worship to continue, so the student was able to say Kaddish. This was in 1966, and it took until 1973 to actually alter the founding grant in court. So that was a bit about the history of worship. I want to say something about the place of Judaism in relation to other religious communities. I came in 1995, the first chaplain who was not a Protestant in 105 years of Stanford's history. Thinking it jarring that I be the Associate Dean of Memorial Church, despite my having a conversation with Steve about the idea of my email address being memchurabbi@stanford.edu, which he told me that Christians would be offended, so I couldn't do.
I don't remember. I was so wise when I was young.
History is ephemeral.
So Bob Gregg, who is here, hired me and was dean of the chapel at the time. He realized that the only way to proceed was to change our titles and our department name. So Memorial Church became the Office for Religious Life, and Stanford Associated Ministries became Stanford Associated Religions. And along with the title change came slowly a cultural change, making the invisible Protestant hegemony in attitude, calendar, and orientation much more visible. We experimented with more multi-faith encounters, leading to the creation now of a multi-faith worship space, albeit quite a bit smaller than Memorial Church, but our new Center for Interreligious Community Learning and Experiences. The university has become more sensitive to Jewish needs, and I want to share with you a case study that took place when we discovered that in 2004, not only did the holidays fall during new student orientation, but Rosh Hashanah was scheduled to fall on the first day of new student orientation. Now, given the length of NSO and the migration of Jewish holidays around the fall months, there are times when the two will inevitably collide. And I think it's probably unfair to ask that there be no NSO during the holidays, because probably we would sometimes be having NSO in August and sometimes in November. So trying to figure out how to manipulate the calendar to be respectful at the same time that all of the other contingencies need to be taken into consideration would require even more math expertise than I think we have on this campus. So in 2004, the first day of new student orientation, with the opening convocation, the spirited greeting of move-in that Stanford is known for, where each of the RAs memorize the names of the students who are coming to their dorms and shout them out as the students are coming in with their luggage, and the travel that's required. Having the first day of NSO on Rosh Hashanah was quite untenable. Fortunately, this was something that we discovered early, and 2 years earlier, I had met with the staff in the registrar's office. We had looked at 10 years of the High Holy Day calendar and determined which years coincided with NSO, and which could be satisfied by just ensuring that nothing happened on that day that was required, but only discretionary, and which really created a problem. In 2004 was our first really big problem. I don't know if you remember this, but in those days, NSO began on a Thursday. And there were a number of suggestions that we put forth. One was beginning NSO a day early. One was shortening NSO and beginning after Rosh Hashanah. Another was shifting by a week, beginning a week later and reducing the length of the winter break. Another was shifting NSO by 5 days to begin on the Tuesday after Rosh Hashanah and shorten the term by 3 days. I've said a little bit about some of the issues. Convocation is really a very large one because it's not only the first opportunity for students and parents to know what Stanford says it stands for. It also is an opportunity for the entire community to come together in a ritual way. There were other issues related to residential education. When would RA training take place? Where would the funding come from for student staff, people who come to campus early, the volunteers for orientation, the student advisors, the RAs? If there were to be an additional day, who would be paying for that? What would be the impact on sophomore college, which takes place before students come to campus and during the first week of new student orientation? How would early move-in affect upper class students? So these were some of the contingencies that were trying to be considered. And I was told by many people sitting in this room that Stanford would never alter its academic calendar to accommodate the Jewish ritual calendar. It was a pipe dream. It was a fantasy. Very nice to raise all the arguments. You could have the most cogent argument in the world. It wasn't going to happen. It never had happened before. It won't happen ever. The involvement of several people changed that reality, including several people who are in this room. We argued that it was untenable for many members of our community, let alone what it conveyed to new Jewish students. Jews who've been prominent at being, at speaking at having a presence at opening convocation, made it clear that if they were asked to choose between being present at new student convocation or at Rosh Hashanah services, they would be at services. There were those who argued that it would undermine the important ambassadorial work in religious pluralism in general and with the Jewish community in particular that we had tried so hard to effect in the last several years. Several well-respected members of our community discussed their concerns with the senior administration, including several of you here. And because those people, as Steve has helped us to see, knew how to navigate and what kind of deportment was essential in achieving one's goals at Stanford University, they were people who were both committed Jews and very well respected and proud Stanford citizens. And their eloquence and their presence and their commitment convinced those who needed to be convinced that despite all of the obstacles, it was essential that new student orientation be moved. In 2004, new student orientation took place on the Tuesday following Rosh Hashanah. There turned out to be some unanticipated benefits for the timing, and in the years since, new student orientation has begun on Tuesday and run through Sunday. There are still calendar conflicts, and there are reminders and clarifications that we regularly submit to the faculty, that we have on the registrar's website, and that we have in the new student orientation literature. I once had a friend who said it takes a year to go from we've never done it this way to we've always done it this way. One of the things that our students in the room would say has always been the case is that there's a page in the new student orientation calendar which enumerates all of the religious worship opportunities. And in the years, as was the case this year and last year, when high holidays coincided with new student orientation, there's a little articulation of how that has been addressed, what things will and won't take place, ensuring that nothing that's required during the period of the holidays will that students should feel free to be able to worship in whatever way is appropriate. In the calendar, And in the registrar's website, there's a little note about religious holidays that says Stanford has a long tradition of supporting faculty, students, and staff in their observance of significant religious holy days. In the complex process of creating the academic calendar, religious holy days are but one of many considerations. The university administration has been helpful in facilitating communication and encouraging respect and understanding when there are academic calendar conflicts with religious holy days. Most instructors will be cooperative and flexible regarding students' religious observance when they receive appropriate and early communication. And if a student is planning not to attend class or take an exam because of a religious holiday, he or she should convey this information to instructors in advance so the students will not be disadvantaged as a result of religious practice, and a couple of pieces about what to do in case there's any kind of conflict. So it is now not only in the books, it's also virtually online. Nonetheless, there are, as one might expect, still stumbles. And in 2008, Yom Kippur conflicted with reunion homecoming. I discovered that RH in the Alumni Association means reunion homecoming, not Rosh Hashanah, as it does in my abbreviations. It fell on the Thursday. Yom Kippur fell on the Thursday of homecoming weekend. And Hillel, the Office for Religious Life, and the Alumni Association worked very closely to try to minimize the damage, to welcome alumni to attend campus High Holy Day services. And in the course of doing that, once again, we generated some significant discussion about how we try to address the religious needs and commitments of students, faculty, staff, and alumni. Steve talked about how this is a place where there's religious integration. We've been working on a kosher, a vision for kosher food that's different than is the case in any other college or university. We began by recognizing that we wanted for there to be food for observant Jewish students and observant Muslim students, which is easy to do with kosher and halal meat. But as we were thinking about how to do that, we recognized that there are also Hindu students and some religious students who are vegan and vegetarian. And so we created the model for a religiously sensitive dining option, which is still in process, and in part because we're raising money for it, and the idea to do it coincided with the economic downturn, so we're still in the process of raising money. But the intention is to have two kitchens, one that's meat and one that's milk, but have the food served in a location where observant students and students for whom their friends are observant but they're not can eat together. So that's one of the things that we're very excited about. And as an intermediate step, Joe will talk about the kosher options on campus right now, which very much grew out of the appreciation for the Kennedy Kosher Co-op, which was operative when I first came. And I think that as there is more infrastructure for Jewish students, there also are more observant Jewish students. I was contacted several years ago by some folks in the admissions office saying, there are a number of observant students that we really want to come to Stanford. Will you call them and let them know what Jewish life is like here? That was definitely a change from when I first came. And we had some wonderful conversations, but a lot of uncertainty about how do we actually integrate students who have religious needs. So we've come a long way, baby, and we still have a fair place to trek. So thank you, and I look forward to your contributions to the history of Jewish life.
if Rabbi Patty is a newcomer, I really don't know what that makes me, only arriving here in 2007. But I would like to talk with you all for a bit about what sort of in my mind is the lore of the recent student Jewish history here at Stanford. It's important to recognize when talking from a student perspective that 4 years is a generation. And so the stories I'm telling you hark back 2 generations ago. We're very short-memoried people as a student body. So I'd like to take a chance to sort of look at some of the transitions we've gone through using the development of certain student institutions here and student-run institutions. I think within that you can start to see a lot of different kinds of change that have gone on in the past 8 years. But it's important to recognize when talking about student institutions here, and in general with Jewish institutions here, be it the Office for Religious Life, the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, Hillel Chabad, or any of the above, the majority of Jewish students on this campus aren't directly connected or wouldn't call themselves affiliated with any of those. And it's really sort of interesting the kind of interplay that even without that direct interaction, be it maybe just an event a year or a couple emails they see, it's sort of, I feel the rise of these Jewish institutions has affected Jewish students throughout the campus, regardless of their direct connection. You can see it in the day-to-day interactions. A lot of times you'll have in dorms students who never connect directly, talking with their friends who are very involved about their Judaism. And so the way in which I feel like this is a large change, my mom was class of 69, and I don't think she mentioned her Judaism more than twice in her time here at Stanford. I think now you'll have those conversations in dorms between 2 students, like, oh, you're Jewish, I'm Jewish. And I think that really is pervasive throughout the community, even outside of the affiliated or institutional circles. So I'd like to focus specifically on the rise of what is currently called the Jewish Student Association. It is what is known as a volunteer student organization funded by the ASSU, which I'll get to in a bit. And in the rise of the JSA, you really start to see a lot of the changes that have come about really rapidly in the community here, and I think are just getting started. Following that, I'd like to talk more about the state of, in general, Jewish organizations on campus and what we have these days. And with many of these things springing up to prominence only in the last 2-3 years. Like, since my time as a freshman, I'd say there are 5 or 6 new organizations I can list. So to look at the history of what is currently the Jewish Student Association, you have to look back many, many years to think roughly 2004. This is back to the era, this is towards the end of the era of the Kennedy Kosher Co-op. And back then there was something called the Jewish Student Association. It was entirely student-run. It wasn't affiliated with Hillel, Stanford. It was just a group of people who got together. They held largely social events. With that unaffiliation came a certain amount of freedom. They, could purchase alcohol, throw parties, and all those other things, which we get into other legal ties nowadays. And there's a certain freedom in that. And in addition to that was the time period towards the end of the Kennedy Kosher Co-op, which was sort of a core for the Jewish community of Stanford at the time. So in the changes and growth of Hillel at the time, they recognized that they did not have a student board to help with programming. And so Hillel created what was the Jewish Leadership Council, the JLC. And this created an interesting sort of dichotomy, because before what you had was this largely student-run thing, and now there's an institutionally affiliated organization. And with that, there was even an overlap. The JLC had a social chair. And so with the JLC social chair existing, JSA felt, well, we don't really have a purpose, and one by one, being an informal organization, just sort of faded out. And with that, so then you had the sort of a start of the rise of official Jewish programming and officially funded and supported Jewish programming here. It's run by students at Stanford, largely coming through Hillel and the JLC. About, 5 years ago, there was an ASSU senator by the name of Danny Arbeiter. His influence on this community, both the larger Stanford political scene and the Jewish community at Stanford, cannot be overstated. So in serving as an ASSU senator, he could help direct the funds of the ASSU. And he came to the realization that if there's a black student union and there's an organization for Hispanic students, why is there not a Jewish student organization? And with that, he drafted the paperwork, and I'm not sure if he knew he was taking an old name or if these were just the words he picked. He put together the VSO documentation for the Jewish Student Association. And with that came the need for a board, and naturally there was already a pre-existing student board, so the JSA became ran by the JLC. And here what you have is this interesting wedding of a student-run organization and student-provided funding to the institution, to an existing institution on campus. And another very important contribution Danny Arbeiter made, especially when thinking about the unaffiliated at the time, is he was one of the first owners of what is known as one of the larger email chat list on campus today, known as Kibbutz. Kibbutz receives emails from any Jewish student can post to it. It's entirely unofficial. It's got can only be posted to by students for students. And it carries with it sort of a bridge to as many students as possible. Eventually, what happened is with the this is actually a very recent sort of activity. The JSA in its couple years of existence has been reinventing itself every year based on where the students on campus are. And recently, there's been a very strong, sharp rise of an undergrad community at participating at Chabad. And with that has come sort of an interesting question of, so where does JSA fit in all this? And so you've had more action. I think this is true across the board with Jewish student organizations here, of student leadership by students, for students, looking for advice from the institutions we have, but more and more seeking to be our own. And especially with the resources of the JSA, this has been a direction that we've been moving in for some time, and it's sort of interesting to see how it's taking shape. And to be honest, I don't really know where it's going to stop. The rate of change of this Jewish community is like nothing I've seen before. Now with that, an increasing rise towards student independence, you've seen certain things that really have been run more and more by students, including more Jewish student organizations popping up around campus. Currently, we have both a Greek fraternity, the Jewish fraternity AE Pi, and a Jewish sorority, AE Phi. There's Stanford Israel Alliance, there's Jewish Queers, there's of course the Jewish Student Association, there's Challah for Hunger, there's a new klezmer band which has recently formed. The founders of many of these things are in the back of the room right now if you're curious. There's a new social action group which is just getting off the ground. There's Stanford Israel Alliance, which has gotten active in the last 6 years, and with all that, it's been a very quick time for change. Chabad has also formed and now has its own VSO, and most of these things have been created or risen to prominence just in these last 4 years. I've been able to see, and like I said, the leaders who founded them are still in the back of the room. And so with this, you can sort of see the rapid rate of change and the growth of this community that thanks to finally having in place the resources of the Hillel buildings, the funds of the ASSU, this was a community and a place that had the resources and the potential for a very rapid change for the 10% of Jewish students here who are of undergrads here who are Jewish. And so sort of in this critical moment, you have this arrival of resources and interest, and it's really sort of spiked. And I can't say in 4 years where this community will be. I really have no idea. It's all I can do best is to try and give it a push, and along with the other student leaders, and see what's going to happen. But it is growing very rapidly, and. I guess briefly to discuss the history of kosher dining here. It's been a bit of a process, but I can say, for those of you who do not know, there is currently kosher dining served by Stanford Dining 3 times a week at Florence Moore Hall, right in the heart of campus. And we have students of different backgrounds, all sorts of different backgrounds, participating to sort of form a critical mass necessary to have kosher dining provided by the university. And it's been a process. It started many years ago with another, and in fact, I think we'd all be remiss if we mentioned Jewish history at Stanford without the name Adina Danzig. I think another person whose contribution cannot be overstated, and her efforts in starting the conversation of kosher dining and getting that off the ground, and also with the arrival of a student who sent a letter directly to President Hennessy talking about how he couldn't eat on campus, Jared Marks. And between, again, we had this sort of unique timing and arrival of the long-time efforts of Adina and the pressing need of a student here to sort of be the catalyst for action. And so in all sorts of different parts of the Jewish community here, you're seeing that sort of pattern of resources meeting with need and creating something new. And it's really hard to say where that will be, like I said, in 4 years. So I can really just say that I'm very thankful and happy for what I've seen grow here. And this is it's a very exciting time to be a Jewish student at Stanford University.
So, panelists, thank you very much. This has just been fascinating to listen to the various perspectives that we have been graced with this afternoon, and to see the breadth and the depth of Jewish life at Stanford. We have time for a few questions or comments from all of you, and I am going to, or somebody will be passing a microphone around. Great. So if you'd raise your hands, we'll get a mic to you. It's really important to use the microphone and to speak into it, because this program is being recorded, and it will be on Stanford iTunes so that other folks can listen to it. So please, when you're asking your question or making an observation or opining on something or other, please make sure you speak into the mic that will be given to you. So with that.
I just wanted to make a comment about the history. I think the big push for growth in Hillel began right around 1975, and I think the then new Hillel rabbi, R.A. Carton, was largely responsible for it. So I'd sort of like to get that on the record. Mm-hmm. I became a member of the board of Hillel, and I myself was new in 1975.
I'd like to make a couple of observations and opine also, if that's all right.
Well, I'm surprised.
I have a somewhat different perspective on the sort of the arc of the relationship between Stanford and the Jewish community, or Jews, since the Jewish community is a relatively recent development at Stanford. I think it's partly the result of the fact that most people tend to look at history as if it began when they became aware of it. I think that's true even of some historians I know. Certainly it's true of some historians I know when they're talking about politics, subject that I know something about. The reason my view is somewhat different from some that you've heard is because I arrived at Stanford roughly 30 years before Steve and Patty did. And so I saw a development of events at Stanford that's somewhat different from theirs. They came relatively late to the scene. I came in 1962 as the first Jewish dean at Stanford. I was associate dean of the graduate division. The condition of Stanford at the time can be seen by the fact that when I accepted the position, I called my parents to tell them of the good news, and the first thing my mother said was, "Do they know you're Jewish?" I don't think they did. Well, Al Bowker may have, but Fred Terman certainly didn't know I was Jewish, and he didn't seem to care. It was not easy to be the only Jew in the administration of Stanford. I immediately became the object of all of the grievances of Jews who were then at Stanford. And as most of you know, although maybe not all members of the Historical Society know, when it comes to grievances, Jews are at the top of the league table.
There's actually empirical proof for that.
Yeah.
There are social scientific studies about people who complain, and we do it well.
I got a call one day around Christmas time from somebody who said, "There's a Christmas tree on top of the new dormitory that's going up. Take it down." And I said, "Well, I don't have anything to do with taking down Christmas trees," but I looked into it, and it turned out that it was the custom among construction workers to put something on top of a building, on the roof of the building, when they had completed the outside shell. And those workers had decided to put up a Christmas tree. So I had to tell this person, "I'm sorry, there's nothing that can be done about it. They're working on the building. It's their union, damn it. We can't do anything about it." I was also involved in the calendar problems, which go way, way, way back, as Patty said. Again, that's an issue that I couldn't do anything about. In fact, I didn't know who could do something about it. It took me a couple of years to find out from Bill Miller, who was then provost and one of the cleverest bureaucratic academic politicians I've ever known, that the academic calendar was the responsibility of the faculty, not the administration, and that I shouldn't have anything to do with it, and he shouldn't have anything to do with it. We should send it over to the faculty senate and let them wrestle with it. And in fact, some ameliorative steps were taken at the time. Now, why did Stanford change? I think the history of Hillel shows something of that. Marion was were you on the first Hillel board? I think so, yes. I was chairman of the first Hillel board, and the composition of that board is important. It consisted of some of the most distinguished scholars at Stanford: Seymour Martin Lipset, Victor Fuchs, Heinz Uhlau, who else? There were Ken Arrow, that's right. They were the reason, they and others like them, were the reason why Stanford changed. It was clear as the university began to develop that you could not develop a major university without Jewish faculty. That's just a fact. I mean, Fred Terman recognized that. I don't know whether Wally Sterling ever did, but Fred certainly did. And when they came, and others like them came, graduate students followed them. And graduate students, similarly, a large number of the new graduate students were Jewish. And as the interest in developing undergraduate education grew, the same realization came. You cannot have a great university without Jewish students. It's just, I mean, Notre Dame maybe, I don't know. Although I don't consider them a great university.
This is on iTube, YouTube. Can I just respond quickly?
Sure.
None of us purports to be an historian of Stanford. We're not historians of Stanford. And it's very good to see you. It's been a while.
Yes, I know.
We're sharing experiences that we live through. You're sharing experiences that you live through, and thankfully so. And so these are what we offered were pieces, not definitive pieces. They don't purport to be definitive pieces. And so once all of us share as many pieces as possible, I'm an historian of Russian Jewry. Criticize me for my history of Russian Jewry, not for my history of Stanford. I live at Stanford and have loved living here. The history of Stanford, I leave to others. I leave to someone like you.
Well, I don't think you need to be at all defensive about what you said, Steve. But I do think that some of the people here probably understood what you were saying as representing a history of Jews, a part of the history of Jews at Stanford.
A slice.
Especially since you're a historian, it's a natural conclusion. And I rose to speak because I think that the history of Jews at Stanford is imperfectly represented by what's happened since 1990. where there was a huge leap in the place of Jews at Stanford academically and socially and in other respects. But there were a number of smaller steps along the way that made it possible, that laid the foundation for that leap in later years. And that's really what I want people to understand.
Great. Bob, thank you.
I'll be brief. I'd like to add to that. I came in 1963, and one of the important events reason I came from Boston, and I was just appalled when I tried to find some Jewish activity compared to the previous university that I was attending. And it was quite obvious that something important did happen to Stanford then. And the medical school clinical departments moved down from San Francisco, and they hired a complete department of biochemistry from Washington University in 1959. And the majority of those people hired were Jewish. So this is supporting the point. There was a prior person here who was very important. And there's Dr. May, actually, was an individual who, I don't know who he was, but he was shepherding the Jewish students here on the campus. But they had a taxi service, you may be interested, that would meet at the Oval to take them to that to the tire store downtown. And so I want to get that across. There are two people who were important. Wally Sterling was supportive. I was in a committee, and I was in a position to know that he was supportive. But Robert McAfee Brown was a very, very, very important individual. And Bob Gregg, I would say also. And I think they should be mentioned prominently if you're going to do a history. You must take the situation into account, the circumstances surrounding it, and the people who were involved, period. Thank you.
While the microphone is being passed, I just want to make one comment, which is that when Norm asked us to be on the panel and told us it was an hour and a half, my response was we need a day and a half. So, as Steve says, this was by necessity little tiny slices, and I'm very grateful for the contributions all of you are making.
So we have time, I'll say, for a couple of more questions or comments, and then, unfortunately, we really do have to bring this to a close. So with that, John.
I'm John Ryder. I was the longest-serving Jewish person who was in the admissions office from 1985 to 2000. One of the questions that Robin addressed briefly was the issue of a Jewish quota, which is a subject that Robin and I have talked about for our adult lives. And I actually once asked both Rixford Snyder, it's interesting that he admitted it in public, if there was a Jewish quota. He said no. And I asked John Bonnell, whom I did work with for 15 years and who worked with Rixford, and said there wasn't. And it's an interesting question of how it was, if there was one, and I'm not suggesting there wasn't, how it might have been administered and kind of what the issues were, particularly in comparison to the East Coast, where there was a much denser Jewish population. How many people here went to high school in California versus on the East Coast? And that even if there was one, Stanford was probably relatively liberal. I actually went to the tire store, Robin, when I was a freshman. I had a car, so I drove from Wilbur Hall. The first two Jewish professors at Stanford were hired in the 1930s. Another name, in addition to Wally Sterling, that should be mentioned, is Ray Lyman Wilbur, who was, who knows anything about Ray Lyman Wilbur? He was very, very strongly anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, and he hired Felix Bloch in physics and Daniel Mendelowitz in art. And I asked Mrs. Mendelowitz, her husband was dead, I asked her in the 80s when I started researching this whole question if she would talk to me about this subject, and she would not. Another name that should be mentioned, has already been mentioned a couple of times, is Dick Lyman. And this is a story that he's told many times, and many of you know it. I'm sure Don knows it. But in 1964, three faculty were being offered positions in the history department. One of them was named Barton Bernstein. Another one was named Ivo Lederer, who was from Yugoslavia. Another one was named Mark Mancall, a close colleague of Steve's, whose middle initial is I, which stands for Israel. And There was a professor about to retire who taught European history. Help me, David, what was his name? Hey, David Harris was his name, not the student radical who some of us knew. Yeah, David Harris stood up at a history department faculty meeting and asked his colleagues if he could be assured that these three were gentlemen. I think of Patty's comment about civility and the notion of civility at Stanford, which is a very interesting question in its own right. Mm-hmm. And Dick Lyman has told me that he walked out of the room. He said he was not going to sit still for that conversation, and he walked out.
As I understand, because the transcripts of that discussion actually, I've read the transcripts, and perhaps some of my colleagues in the room might correct me, but if I'm not mistaken, one member of the faculty, one member of my department asked whether he was a gentleman. Another said he has blonde hair and blue eyes, and Johnny Johnson, an historian of Mexico, then a young man and not one of the more prominent figures of the department, at least then, as I heard it, stood up and said, "Gentlemen, we can't speak like this any longer." And I don't know who else stood up. I wonder just apropos of the comment before, and those of us on this panel were invited to be on it. We didn't organize it. It might be an idea, and I would certainly be willing to participate in this. With full modesty and recognizing that whatever I know that I've always only experienced. I haven't written this history and don't purport to do so. Perhaps a kind of multi-generational project might come out of this evening, where a number of people who've lived through this history at different stages, from different vantage points, people from the medical school, I understand the movement of the medical school to Stanford had an enormous impact in this respect, might actually simply come together, and we might transcribe our experiences, all imperfect, all incomplete, and I suspect yours as well as mine, and then these snapshots, once put together, might provide something closer to what some of you expected from this evening and what this evening could not and couldn't possibly have provided. And I throw open that idea. I'd be willing to work with anyone here on it.
Okay, we have time for one final comment.
There's a unsung hero in all of this, and that's Fred Hargadon. Fred was the Dean of Admissions immediately following Rexford Snyder. I happened to chair the Committee on Undergraduate Admissions and Financial Aids. And Fred really looked into the question of why there were so few Jewish students at Stanford and discovered that we had failed to recruit at all the famous high schools that have a large number of Jewish students. Mm-hmm. And he immediately started a process of recruiting at Bronx Science and the corresponding high schools in Philadelphia and Hollywood High, I guess it is, or one of the Jewish high schools in Los Angeles. And we saw an immediate rise in the number of students who were Jewish. I should say I came in '67, and there's another side to all of this, and that is I came as a physicist engineer and was welcomed by the Jewish faculty community in a way that didn't happen at Harvard because there were so many Jewish faculty. And for me, it meant being with faculty in political science and history and other fields, and those links really enriched my life in a way that wouldn't have happened at Harvard. Of course, this university tends to mix much more than Harvard in general, but it really made life rich.
Just to add a time point, Fred started probably 74, 75.
Thank you.
Probably 74, 75. He was still Dean of Admissions when I started.
That's right. He came in 69.
Oh, really? He came in 69.
Sorry. Just Norm, 1 second, just apropos of amnesia. A month ago, I was at a meeting. I'm at the Humanities Council. We were meeting with the Dean of Admissions, And several of us suggested, in order to actually beef up the number of students, like Jewish students, wouldn't it be a good idea to turn to some of the high schools around the country? And he said, no one's ever suggested that before. Okay.
Which reminds me, I was reading an article in the Daily a couple of days ago, and it said that for the first time ever, there was going to be outreach to try and get students interested in a certain aspect of campus life. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? It was done when I was actually a dean here, but as Joe pointed out, a generation is 4 years, and so the memory is very short. We unfortunately have run out of time. I want to thank the panelists. You have been wonderful in sharing your thoughts with us. When I started, I said that this was not going to be a history lesson. What I meant to say, and should have, it was not meant to be the definitive history of Jews and Jewish life at Stanford. And you can see from the comments from all of you sitting out there that is almost an impossible task. Steve's suggestion has a lot of merit because there's no way that 4 people, or even adding in the 4 or 5 folks who spoke sitting out here, can possibly capture the entire history accurately of Jewish life at Stanford. But this was intended to give you a snapshot of the thoughts of the panelists and to, as I said, give you a sense of the vibrancy, the vitality of Jewish life at Stanford University in the year 2011. And I think that has been done remarkably well. And so thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this. Just a quick note, we had a meeting scheduled for March, which is going to be rescheduled. This is for the Historical Society, which is for February, which is going to be rescheduled. Hillel has a lot of programs coming up. The Historical Society has programs coming up. We don't have time to go over all of them here. If you're interested in what they are, go to the various websites. They are wonderful sources of information. Thank all of you very much for being here today. We appreciate your attention and your contributions. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.